The night smelled of roasted chicken, garlic bread, and my father's pride. Our old brownstone on Maple Street in Brooklyn seemed too small for the crowd it was holding. The dining room table was stretched with an extra leaf, chairs borrowed from neighbors, and glasses polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier's light. My mother, Helen, moved from seat to seat, carrying bowls of mashed potatoes and platters of green beans, her apron slightly stained from the gravy she had stirred for an hour. She passed food with the kind of nervous energy only she had, as though feeding people could solve every problem. My father, David, presided at the head of the table like a man conducting an orchestra. His booming voice carried over the clatter of forks and the tinkling of glasses. He lifted his wine and praised my brother, Mark, for his new promotion at the bank in Manhattan. Mark, dressed in a navy suit even though it was Saturday, smiled with the confidence of a man who believed every word of my father's applause was true and deserved. Guests clapped. Laughter rose and fell like a song I no longer recognized, one with a rhythm I had never been taught to dance to. I sat quietly at the far end, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My dress was plain, not designer, and my boots still had a trace of dust clinging to them from the site visit I had rushed back from earlier that afternoon. I was still half in that world of cement, plans, and safety helmets. My father had asked me to be at dinner sharp at 6, and like the dutiful daughter I was supposed to be, I had obeyed, though I arrived carrying an invisible burden that none of them cared to see. When the wine glasses were refilled and the laughter softened, my father's gaze landed on me. He smirked, the kind of smirk that always carried both judgment and performance, as if he wanted everyone else at the table to share in his disapproval. "And then there's my daughter," he said, his words heavy, meant for an audience. "Street cleaner." The words fell like stones into the silence. Guests glanced at one another, some hiding small smiles behind their napkins, others politely pretending they had not heard. Mark chuckled softly, then took another sip of his wine. My father leaned back in his chair, satisfied, as if he had spoken the perfect punchline. I bit the inside of my cheek. They did not know, and they had never cared to ask. None of them had any idea that I was signing million-dollar contracts to build highways, bridges, and road networks across America. They thought I was still the girl who wandered through dirt lots, fascinated by blueprints and construction crews, the girl who came home with muddy boots and no interest in dresses or makeup. I wanted to tell them. I wanted to stand up, to say that last month my firm secured an $18 million contract to rebuild the Riverbend Interchange, one of the most dangerous roadways in the state. I wanted to tell them how my team, Nina, Grace, and Talia, spent nights sketching new exits that would reduce collisions, that would save mothers and children and commuters rushing home. I wanted to tell them that my name was known in city halls, that I was respected among engineers and contractors who trusted me to lead. But when I opened my mouth, my father slammed the door on my words. "Shut up," he snapped, his voice so sharp that even the clink of forks stopped. "You didn't do anything for your parents." The room froze. Ants shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. An old neighbor, Mrs. Porter, looked down at her plate as though her peas were suddenly fascinating. Mark kept smirking, enjoying the weight of my father's approval. My mother fussed with the serving spoon, her hands trembling, but she said nothing. She never did. Heat rose in my chest, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Slowly, deliberately, I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. I stood. Every movement felt heavy, like walking through water. I pushed my chair back, its legs scraping against the hardwood floor, the sound almost deafening in the silence. No one stopped me. I walked past the framed school photos on the hallway wall, past the dent in the doorframe where Mark had once slammed the door during an argument years ago. Each step reminded me of the house that had never truly been a home for me, only a place where I had learned to stay small. When I reached the front door, I felt every pair of eyes still fixed on my back, waiting, perhaps, for me to apologize or laugh along as if it were all a harmless joke. But I didn't. I pulled the door open and stepped outside. The autumn air in New York was cool and sharp. The city hummed beyond the block, buses rumbling, cars honking, voices blending in the night. Somewhere, Late trains screeched along metal rails. I breathed it all in, and for the first time that evening, I felt alive. As I walked away from the house, I thought of the roads I had built, the bridges that bore weight every day because of my calculations and leadership. I thought of the workers who trusted me, the families who drove more safely because of my decisions. My father's words tried to cling to me, but they slid off, powerless against the truth of what I had done. That night, under the glow of streetlights, I made myself a silent promise. I would not let them define me. I would not keep explaining myself to people who never wanted to listen. If they could not see my worth, then I would make sure they never saw me again. I turned the corner, leaving behind the noise of the dinner, the house heavy with pride for one child and disdain for the other. Ahead of me, the city stretched wide and endless, full of strangers who did not know me but who would drive on the roads I built. That was enough. And as the night carried me farther away, I realized that sometimes silence is not weakness, it is power. I woke before dawn in my small apartment in Queens, the kind of morning when the city feels half asleep, its streets still wet from yesterday's rain. My phone was buzzing on the nightstand like a hornet's nest. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just work emails piling up as usual. But the vibration wouldn't stop, and curiosity pulled me out of bed. When I finally picked it up, the first notification nearly knocked the air out of me. My name, my real name, splashed across the morning news. The headline glared back at me. Steel Road's CEO revealed, Brooklyn woman behind billion-dollar projects. I sank onto the edge of my bed, staring at the screen. A reporter on live TV spoke my story as if it belonged to her. They showed pictures of me in a hard hat at a site in Chicago, laughing with a crew of men and women in neon vests. They listed numbers like trophies on a shelf. $120 million for the Harbor Line rebuild near Seattle, $6,400,000 for green sidewalks in Cleveland, $2,900,000 for safe crossings outside a Boston school. Numbers I had lived with for years, now paraded in front of strangers. The secret I had carried so carefully had been torn open. My family, who thought I was just drifting, who had mocked me as a street cleaner, were now seeing me for who I truly was, but not because I told them, because the world did. By noon, my phone had logged 10 missed calls from my father, 6 from my mother, and 4 from Mark. They must have been scrambling, trying to stitch together their pride after realizing how wrong they had been. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I did what I had planned for years in case something like this ever happened. I executed the escape plan I had quietly built. I opened the metal box hidden under my bed. Inside were envelopes, documents, and a new phone still sealed in plastic. I pulled out the packet with my new name, Iris Gray. I had chosen it because it sounded strong and untraceable, a name that could belong to anyone, yet no one. Within hours, I changed my license, updated my company records, and cut the last strings tying me to the life my parents thought they knew. I didn't just change my name. I changed my geography. Within a week, I packed everything that mattered into 2 suitcases and boarded a plane to Chicago. Queens faded into memory as the skyline of a new city rose before me. In Chicago, I found a quiet block on the west side, lined with brick houses and maple trees that burned gold in autumn. One particular 2-bedroom brick home caught my eye. It was modest, with a front porch that seemed to invite sunlight in the afternoon. I bought it for $480,000 in cash through the company, no mortgage, no trail. The transaction was clean, silent. The house was mine, and with it came a sense of invisibility. I hired a painter named Lucas, a kind man who had worked odd jobs his whole life, to cover the walls in warm white. I paid him $3,200 and told him to take his time. He finished in 3 days and thanked me as though I had saved him. I suppose, in a way, I had. I was learning that sometimes money wasn't just power, it was freedom for others, too. Once the house was mine, I turned to my team. Steel Roads was more than a company. It was a family of builders, women, and men who had believed in me when others didn't. I couldn't risk their safety, not with all the attention on me. I moved the projects under new codes, shifted contracts into fresh entities, and made sure my name was scrubbed from the surface. But I didn't leave them empty-handed. I wired bonuses. $15,000 to Nina, $12,000 to Grace, $10,000 to Talia. Each transfer came with a handwritten note. Keep building. Keep it human. They were more than colleagues. They were the only people who understood why I fought for safer roads and cleaner designs. And even if I vanished, I wanted them to carry the torch. When the dust of moving settled, I found myself alone in my new house, surrounded by walls that smelled faintly of fresh paint. I cooked simple meals in the small kitchen, pasta with olive oil, scrambled eggs, and toast with butter. I didn't bother with the table yet. Instead, I ate on the floor with my back against the wall, watching the sunlight fade through the windows. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt kind. Still, the calls didn't stop. My parents left voicemails, voices filled with confusion, maybe even shame. My father's tone was clipped, almost desperate, though he tried to mask it with formality. My mother's messages were softer, like she had finally remembered I was her daughter. Mark's words were short, full of awkward pauses, as though he didn't know whether to scold me or beg for a connection. But I stayed silent. They had silenced me once, cut me off in front of guests, dismissed my worth with a laugh. Now it was my turn to be quiet. Quiet, but powerful. At night, I would sit on the porch with a blanket draped over my shoulders and listen to the city around me. Chicago was different from New York, slower in some ways, harsher in others. I could hear the whistle of trains in the distance, the faint hum of cars passing on nearby streets. It was a city that carried stories in its bricks and steel, and I wanted mine to disappear into its rhythm. The news still tried to chase me. Reporters speculated about my next move, about how a young woman could hide so effectively. Some called me a genius. Others painted me as cold, secretive. They didn't understand that I wasn't hiding out of fear. I was hiding because love had never been given freely in my family. It had always been conditional, measured against Mark's accomplishments, tied to money and appearances. Now I had money. More than enough. What I didn't have, and what I no longer needed, was their approval. In the evenings, I would open my laptop and review the contracts under new aliases, ensuring every detail was still in motion. Bridges in Denver, sidewalks in Cleveland, safety corridors in Boston. Each project was still alive, still breathing. My work didn't end because my identity changed. It only grew stronger. Some nights, though, the weight of everything pressed on me. I would lie in bed and wonder if they ever truly loved me, or if love had always been tangled in expectation. I thought of the dinner table, of my father's voice cutting me down. I thought of the guests' laughter. And then I thought of the roads I had built, the millions of people who drove safely because of my decisions. That was my proof of worth. That was my answer to them. As autumn deepened and the leaves fell onto my new porch, I began to see myself differently. I was no longer just the girl from Brooklyn who had something to prove. I was Iris Gray now, and I was free. The morning after I became Iris Gray, America woke to the sight of my parents on national television. I hadn't planned to watch, but curiosity has a way of creeping into quiet rooms. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat on the new couch in my Chicago house, and flipped the channel to the morning show. The host, Anna, leaned toward them with the kind of careful sympathy talk show hosts are trained to perform. My mother, Helen, sat stiffly in her chair, her hands folded on her lap. I could see the tremble in her fingers, even from the television screen. My father, David, sat beside her, his posture sharp as ever, but his eyes gave him away. He stared into the camera like it was a locked door he had no key for. "We're sorry," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. "We didn't know." My father cleared his throat, his voice deeper, practiced. "She worked hard. We were wrong." He paused, swallowing pride as if it were poison. "We love her. We love our daughter." Anna nodded gravely. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Then my father, ever the showman, made his announcement. We will donate $200,000 to the National Road Safety Alliance in her name. I nearly laughed. Money, always their language, their translation of love. $200,000 was generous, yes, but it was also just another performance. A way to show the country that they could admit fault while still writing a check to erase the discomfort. He looked smaller than I remembered. On television, without the power of his booming voice filling a dining room, he was just a man. Not the giant who had towered over me my whole life. The camera panned to the studio audience. I froze when I saw them, faces I recognized from that dinner, the same guests who had laughed at his cruel street cleaner joke. There they were, sitting neatly in studio chairs, pretending they had always believed in me, nodding solemnly at my parents' sorrow. Their hypocrisy was so transparent I could almost see the smirk underneath their pity. I sipped my coffee and let the bitter taste ground me. I thought of the words I had needed as a girl. We're proud of you. We believe in you. You matter. Instead, I'd been fed a steady diet of comparisons to Mark, of criticisms disguised as humor, of silence where encouragement should have lived. I did not hate them. Not my parents, not even the guests. Hate would have meant they still had a hold on me, that their opinions still mattered. But I also did not trust them. Trust had been broken in the same way a bone shatters. It might knit together, but it would never be as strong again. After the interview aired, the search began. My phone lit up with messages from old friends in New York. Your parents are looking for you, one said. They went to your old apartment, said another. My landlord in Queens called to say 2 unfamiliar cars had parked across the street all weekend, my father's voice demanding answers in the hallway. They even drove up to Lake Erie, to the summer house we used to rent when I was a child. A place that smelled of wet wood and sunscreen, where Mark had learned to fish, and I had learned to read maps of the shoreline. Neighbors there reported seeing them, asking if anyone knew where I'd gone. I imagined my father standing on the dock, looking out at the water, hoping I would somehow walk back from the past. Mark's colleagues at the bank called me. Their voices hushed. Your brother's been asking around, they said. He wants to know if you'll come home. But even his reach, cushioned by titles and connections, couldn't find me. They searched in all the wrong places because they still didn't know me. They thought of childhood haunts, old friends, and familiar apartments. They never understood that I had left them long before dinner. I had left them piece by piece. The first late nights drafting plans with Nina, the first time I chose work over Sunday lunch, the first contract signed under steel roads. Every mile of road I helped build had been another step away from them. I had learned to leave while still sitting at their table. In Chicago, I kept my life small and deliberate. I learned the names of the grocers at the corner store, nodded to neighbors walking their dogs, and waved to the mailman who always wore a Cubs cap. No one asked me who I had been. To them, I was Iris Gray, the new woman in the brick house with the wide porch. That anonymity was a gift. But my parents were relentless. They bought TV time. They spoke at charity events, their voices cracking with rehearsed emotion. They asked me to forgive them on live broadcasts. They pleaded into the cameras, hoping I was watching. And sometimes I was. At night, when the world felt quiet enough to peek at ghosts, I would turn on the television and watch their apologies. I saw the sincerity in my mother's shaking hands, the practiced regret in my father's careful words. They said love more times in those interviews than they had ever said to me in my entire childhood. But love shouted into a camera is not the same as love whispered at the dinner table when a daughter needs to hear it. Love paraded for strangers is not the same as love practiced daily in small acts of kindness. So I let them speak. I let them search. I let them spend money and energy trying to find me. And all the while, I built my life in silence. Some evenings, I would sit on the porch, the street lamps humming faintly, and wonder if they would ever stop. Would they ever realize that the daughter they wanted back no longer existed? The girl from Brooklyn who had waited for their approval was gone. What remained was a woman who built roads for strangers, who carried whole cities in her contracts, who no longer needed their recognition. Their search was a map they would never finish drawing. They could drive from New York to Lake Erie, from Boston to Denver, from Seattle to Chicago, but they would not find me. Not truly. because I had done what they never expected. I had learned to belong to myself. Chicago had already begun to feel like a second skin, a city that wrapped itself around me in both steel and silence. The brick house on the west side was mine, its porch light steady at night, its walls holding the echo of fresh paint. But the longer I stayed there, the more I realized that hiding was not enough. I had not built my life to vanish into shadows. I had built it to shape the ground people walked on. And if I were going to live here, then this city deserved my hands. I began walking the block with a clipboard in hand and a cap pulled low over my hair. To the neighbors, I looked like just another woman with notes and errands. But I was watching, measuring, studying the flow of life on the streets around me. At the corner of Maple and 3rd, I met Eva, a woman in her 60s who used a wheelchair. She told me she hadn't crossed that intersection in 2 years because the curb was too high and the ramp was cracked. "I just don't go out much anymore," she admitted, her voice small but steady. A few blocks down, I stood with Olivia, a teacher who shepherded her class of second graders across an unmarked intersection every afternoon. "One of these days," she said, gripping her whistle, "a car won't stop in time. I pray every morning before I bring them out here." I could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of 30 children in her care pressing against her shoulders. At the bakery on the corner, I met Miguel, a man who rose at 3 every morning to bake bread. His deliveries were supposed to be quick, but trucks clogged his street, idling in front of his door, costing him $500 a week in lost business. He shrugged, trying to hide the frustration, but I heard the exhaustion in his sigh. Their stories pieced together like a puzzle. A street too dangerous here, a curb too high there, traffic that bled into daily life. I knew the language of these problems. They weren't just inconveniences, they were cracks in the foundation of trust between people and the city they lived in. So I drafted a plan. My clipboard is filled with sketches, arrows, and numbers. New ramps for Eva. Raised crosswalks for Olivia's children. A small roundabout to slow reckless drivers. Street trees to shade the sidewalks. A bike lane that actually connected instead of ending abruptly in the middle of nowhere. I priced it out. $1,300,000. I called old allies in the city, people who had trusted me before steel roads had a name, and asked them if Chicago was ready for something new. They hesitated at first, but when I offered to cover $300,000 myself if they met me halfway, the hesitation faded. A week later, I wrote the check. I signed it Iris Gray. The first morning of construction, I arrived before sunrise. The air was cool, the kind that wakes you up more than coffee ever could. The crew gathered, women and men together, hard hats tilted, steaming cups of cheap diner coffee in their hands. They laughed as they measured the curb, chalk lines stretching like promises across the asphalt. A girl named Maya, no older than 22, handed me a marker. "Sign the first barrel," she said. I hesitated, then scrawled across the bright orange plastic. "For anyone who is told to be quiet." As the sun rose, golden light spilled over the machines and the workers' faces. The noise of jackhammers and drills filled the street, but beneath it I heard something quieter, steadier. Hope. Neighbors leaned out of windows to watch. Children pointed. Miguel brought fresh bread to share with the crew, his smile wide for the first time since I'd met him. Eva wheeled herself down to the corner just to see the curb torn out. She cried softly, covering her mouth with her hands. That afternoon, as dust rose and the smell of tar lingered, my phone buzzed. My new phone. I almost ignored it, but the headline on the screen caught my eye. Brooklyn parents plead again for estranged daughter. I opened the link, and there they were, my parents on live television once more. They said my name. They said they loved me. They apologized again, their voices breaking, their eyes wet. They spoke into the camera, hoping I would look back. And I did for a moment, but then I turned the volume down. I wasn't ready to give them that piece of me again. Instead, I stepped onto the new crosswalk, the white paint still bright against the dark road. A small truck slowed as it rolled across, the driver tipping his hat toward me. Children waved as they skipped along the sidewalk. Neighbors nodded to one another, strangers bound together by something as simple as a safer corner. In that moment, I understood myself clearly. I am not a street cleaner. I am a builder. I build what families actually need: safe ways home, lights that work, corners that forgive mistakes. I build communities, not reputations. I do it with teams who are paid well, credited by name, and respected for their work. I do it with numbers, with lines, with care. If my parents love money more than their daughter, then money can keep them company. I will keep my company: the roads, the bridges, the sidewalks, the lives quietly protected every time someone gets home safely. At night, when construction paused and the street grew still again, I sat on my porch. The porch light threw a soft circle on the steps, moths dancing in the glow. I drank water from a tall glass and listened to the hum of the city settling into rest. The street outside was different now, no longer a danger, but a place that breathed safety into the air. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who sat at the family dinner table in Brooklyn, small under her father's voice. She had walked out of that house believing she might never be enough. But here I was, in a city far from theirs, proving with every crosswalk and ramp that she had been enough all along. Somewhere in America, I knew another dinner was happening. Another father was praising a son while overlooking a daughter. Another girl was being told she was small. But one day, she would step outside, too. She would breathe deeply, choose her own road, and walk it with strength, and when she did, the city would make room. The city would slow down. The city would hear her voice.